This video discusses the movie A Serbian Film, and as such we'll be talking about scenes that will undoubtedly be shocking to some. This YouTube edition of this video will not include the images of the film that may be described as explicit. However, as a necessary part of a serious discussion of this film and its treatment out the hands of the censor, the content that is discussed may upset some. If you don't know this film's content, then please Google it and find out before you watch this video if you're likely to be offended. It's not my intention to cause upset, and I ask you to take responsibility for choosing to watch this. Thank you. Winning the prize for the most controversial film of, well, a long time, if not ever, a Serbian film, even on paper, looks like the kind of film that could never be shown. Sex and violence are thrown together to tell a deeply dark and astoundingly angry tale of power and its victims, and how they are both abused by the figures of authority. Miloš, a former porn star of some note, is invited to take part in a new, more artistic porn film than has ever been made before. The offer, coming as it does when Miloš is struggling to make ends meet, reluctantly perks his interest due to the huge financial package attached to it. Conflicted between his past career that he left behind and his current family life, which is threatened with poverty, Miloš meets the director, Vukmir, who lays out the concept for the film, in which Miloš will not know the nature of the work until he is faced with it at the time. Understandably, Miloš is concerned, and a brief investigation of the director's past results in a disturbingly vague result. Faced with poverty, however, Miloš agrees to go ahead with the shoot, and finds himself involved in an increasingly dark and morally disturbing series of situations for the sake of Vukmir's art. These situations spiral quickly into a nightmare of abuse and horrific events that are out of Miloš's control, and there seems to be no limit to the depths that Vukmir will plumb for his work. A Serbian film is open to the most intense reaction a film has received from its target audience that I can remember. The horror community, usually in my experience the most capable of coping with such an extreme film, has sat through films of the likes of The Human Centipede, the August Underground films, Necromantic and Grotesque, and usually respond in healthy debate about the merits of the more extreme images and ideas that these films present, regardless of which side of the fence they fall on. A Serbian film has, however, managed to immediately provoke the majority of some of the most hardcore horror fans to either grudgingly concede the film's perceived excessiveness and unsuitability, through to an outright revulsion and indeed anger for the movie's content. The hefty 4 minutes of cuts recently demanded by the BBFC resulted in its withdrawal from Fright Fest, which received a curiously mixed reaction amongst the filmgoers, and even for myself provoked deeply conflicted emotions of resignation, a certain degree of understanding for the decision, and anger at the re-rise of censorship, the kind of which has scary parallels with the early 80s. If there's one good thing that this film has done, it's shown that censorship is alive and well. After having had the best part of a week to let the film sink in, things have emerged from the experience, and make no mistake, this film is an experience, a truly gruelling one. So let's explore the film that has created such a furore. A Serbian film is primarily a study of power and control. Its concerns are specifically about Serbia, but has relevance beyond the borders of that so recently and apparently still troubled country. The two main characters, those of Miloš and Vukmir, represent very different ends of the social structure. Miloš seems to represent the common man. He's struggling with maintaining a basic lifestyle for himself and his family. Vukmir, on the other hand, is a figure of authority, well off and highly educated. His sense of superiority permeates his every word, and he displays a self-assured egotism in the merits of his vision, despite the lack of evidence for his stance. The various other characters tend to act as extensions to what these central characters represent. Indeed, a complete social structure exists from the family of Miloš, through professional relations, the police, and the enforcers of the wishes of Vukmir, the authority figure. This structure acts as a small-scale representations of the layer of society, from the individual through to the highest levels of authority. The use of sex in this film is also not as straightforward as it may seem. Sex, and more specifically sexual drive, is portrayed not simply as being a physical act, but something that is a fundamental part of who we are. Sex in the Serbian film also acts as a metaphorical representation of violence. Miloš suppresses it, partly through the use of whiskey. But the violence is bubbling just underneath the surface, as can be seen in the scene where, after his wife inquires why he doesn't take her, like he took the girls in his porn career, to which he responds violently by taking her in such a manner, which comes close to rape. This aspect of Miloš's identity, something that served him in his past career, resurfaces without much provocation, and it's obviously still a big part of who he is, though he successfully restrains it. Not being a Serbian myself, I can't comment on the Serbian mentality specifically, but the theme is something that is universal to a greater or lesser extent. Being as sex is such a powerful element of the character makes it a very useful tool for his manipulation, and here we can really introduce Vukmir. Vukmir is the director, a man who uses and manipulates sex for his own purpose and gain. His boundaries are seemingly limitless as he leads Milos blindly into a world where sex and violence are blended seamlessly, not only enticing him with the promise of a better life, but steadily moving his boundaries of acceptance until Milos can go no further, when Vukmir has to employ more extreme methods. With this microcosm of a social structure in place and the use of sex as a representation of violence, the movie follows Milos's seduction and coercion back into his old ways by the power above him. Vukmir draws Milos into situations in such a way as to hopefully desensitize him gradually for the increasingly disturbing and abusive scenarios that he has in mind. Milos, however, reacts with increasing anger to the presence of a young girl at the shoot, and after Vukmir screens a new concept for him, newborn porn, Milos storms out only to begin acting oddly, then finding himself waking up a few days later. The use of children in this film is one thing in particular that understandably generates the most hostility. The two children portrayed in the film represent different aspects of innocence, that of total innocence with the baby, and of corrupted innocence with the girl. The scene of newborn porn is pivotal in the film. Firstly, it represents the taking of innocence from the very beginning, and it's also the moment that Milos finally realises the nature of what Vukmir is doing, and angrily rejects it outright. From this point, Vukmir employs drugs to force Milos's participation, moving from subversion to coercion, to make him compliant. The young girl, who we later see being offered up by her grandmother for Milos to flower, is commenting on the long-standing nature of this abuse, as she herself states that this is how it was with her father. All these things are part of the full picture that's being presented of a society struggling with a violent nature, a product of grooming by those in control and its perpetuation by those in charge. When this is rejected by the people who have been subjected to it, then the ruling class are forced to enforce it by other means. In Milos's case, the use of drugs that supercharges libidinous violence to the point where he's no longer in control. As Milos discovers what he did during his blackout, he's revolted at what he was made to do, and the most devastating blow comes with his final animalistic act, where suddenly, even through the incredible stupor of the drugs he was assaulted with, he suddenly realises how far things have irretrievably gone. Unable to live with the consequences of what happened, their final act is violated by the successor to Vukmir, who fulfills the goal of not only destroying but violating the family even after death. This is a very brief analysis of what is a complex film with a subtext buried in metaphor. I've barely begun to fully explore all the avenues and imagery of the film. However, this is an overview of the ideas that the film explores. The difficulty of a Serbian film comes primarily with the transposition and combination of sex and violence, coupled with particularly the depiction of children in sexual situations. The film's story being based around pornography would also at a casual glance suggest an exploitative aspect. Even I've struggled with reconciling the nature of the imagery and events with any justification for going so very far beyond the bounds of most people's level of acceptability. However, when one looks closely at the film, it's surprising how little of the actual imagery is truly explicit. Indeed, many more mainstream films actually contain shots with far more explicit content. It's really about what we think is happening, what we think that we see, that creates the shocking reaction, when in reality the most explicit aspect of a Serbian film is really the situation and event, not specifically the imagery, which really reaches its most explicit with the rape and simultaneous beheading of a mother of the girl. But even with this, it's as much about what's happening as an event that makes this as shocking a scene as it is. The imagery itself is not unprecedented. When watching the Serbian film, it reminded me very much of the reaction Salo had, and continues to have. The parallels between the two are rather marked. Both have a similar subtext explored through the viewing of the abuse of power through the device of sex and violence.
Both follow a path that involves the characters being reduced to a state where they're little more than tools of the controlling power, and both deliver a powerful and astonishingly angry response to the situations that they individually comment upon. I cannot deny the offensive nature of a Serbian film. It pursues its goals using a highly emotive and upsetting approach that challenges the viewer's boundaries, and in some regards may fall foul of certain rushed-in laws that deal clumsily with the issues of representation of children, in response to the hysterical fixation the media has with such imagery. The thing is that not only is a Serbian film not truly explicit in anything other than its tone, but its aim doesn't seem to be to titillate either. The sex is always brutal, ferocious and hateful. I'd even make the distinction and describe it specifically as fucking, given its aggressive nature. It's a tool of dominance and abuse which, granted, some may feel excited about in some circumstances, but the consequences for the characters in the movie are clear. The extraordinary events of this movie have a focused context, something that many films really ignore, and although the initial reaction to such extreme series of events is understandably negative, the film stays with you for days after, giving the viewer time to process what they've seen. Salo also operates in this manner, but where these two films differ is in their visual style. Salo distances the viewer with its formal, austere framing of shots, often from a distance, whereas Serbian film mixes its shots more readily, taking a more recognisable cinematic approach, often spending time up close up to the events. However, both films alienate the viewer from the action by means of reminding the viewer that they are watching a film. A Serbian film does this with obscure shots and harsh, heavy processing of the image apart from anything else. I don't think this film should have been censored. Its potential for violating laws regarding the representation of children says more about the law than it does about the content of the film, and unfortunately the BBFC, even if they thought this film was a masterpiece, would have been hampered by having to take the likelihood of legal action into consideration. Though even that doesn't explain the 4 minutes of cuts. That was beyond reason. This is an example of the BBFC's fixation with certain kinds of content. At one point it was nunchucks and guts, another time it was the slightest suggestion of buggery or even homosexuality, and even for a long time the vaguest suggestion or the possibility of a nipple being caught on camera. Now it's camcorders on screens and sexual assault. I can't see this film getting a full release for a very long time. Maybe time will be kind to it and it'll all gain a retrospective respect, however grudging that Pasolini's film got. Or maybe not. I make no claim to it standing shoulder to shoulder with Salo in any other respect then they approach the same themes using similar devices. Time will tell, and in the meantime a film that was always going to be a fringe foreign language subtitled film has been catapulted into notoriety, regardless of its merit or lack of. Well done guys, another publicity coup well executed.